Thank you for inviting me to this very important symposium, and it's an honor to follow John, whose very large shoes I had to fill when I arrived at the Whitney in 1997. And I think the issues John raises are extremely important, and I know we're going to have also a lot of technical discussion about migration of video, all of that with other papers. So what I thought I would do in this presentation is focus on perhaps the relationship between film and video installation, because I actually don't believe in video art. I don't think there is such a thing. And I think that in the 1990s, when film and video really became major mediums, film, video, slide, sound, anything using technology, became major mediums in contemporary art. A new generation of very young artists who emerged were not interested in categorizing themselves or being put into any kind of box. And they simply were making art. And many of them made art in a number of mediums that could involve a video projection one day, a drawing the next, a painting the next, an installation the next, and they didn't want to be defined by that. What they saw as a very limiting phrase, I know because many of them said that at the time to me, and I remember thinking about that very strongly and thinking about the phenomenon whereby film, at a moment when cinema seemed to be on its last legs, suddenly got an extraordinary second wind, and artists began to work with the medium of film, which is extraordinarily technically difficult to do if you're not trained in it, which they weren't. They began to make 35mm film loops, 16mm film loops. They started to work with Super 8 film, and they really, I'm talking about, of course, people like Steve McQueen, Taster Dean, Stan Douglas, Jonathan Monk, Matthias Paledner, Sharon Lockhart, Thomas Demand, etc. The list goes on, and there are several wonderful examples of these works in the Haunted exhibition. They really took on film, the physical medium of film, just as film labs were closing, demonstrating that Ross Krauss argument that at the very moment when a medium seems to be dying, it has this sort of last burst of energy. And this was occurring in America and Europe, although there are many more film labs in America than Europe, although that's now beginning to change. And at the same time, what was emerging was this very strong impulse towards the cinematic, by which I mean something that was about cinema, the look of cinema, the history of cinema, the appropriation of cinema, but did not use film or the cinema necessarily, although in some cases it did. And the cinema came back as a physical space, again, at a moment when at the time it seemed like it was about to go out of business, figuratively and literally. And so the cinematic, and of course I'm thinking of Douglas Gordon, Pierre Weig, Isaac Julian, Matthew Barney, Shirin Neshat, etc., we can all make those lists. The cinematic began to assert itself as a very important impulse for a new generation. And it was at this point, I would argue, that film and video really started to collapse into each other in terms of the inability to really define any one movement or group of artists. And it became video receded and became something else. And it's really interesting that people have taken DVD on as a term, like it's more sort of interesting than video. So I made a DVD. At the same time, people say I made a film, but it was on video, and there was no such thing as any sort of celluloid involved. Now, at the point where this was occurring, there was, towards the end of the 90s, a huge invisibility of historical work in film installation in particular. And what's interesting is that as this young generation came up, so the galleries responded very quickly and started selling film and video installation. Who would have thought that film loop installations could command such large amounts of money and gain such prominence and respect in collecting terms and in museum terms? It was fantastic. And museums duly collected this work very well, and there are now very strong collections at Guggenheim, MoMA, the Tate, all sorts of places have a fantastic group of holdings of work from the 90s and the 2000s. However, very few, if any, museums, apart from the Whitney and a handful of museums, focused on the 60s and 70s And so this work was in danger of becoming completely extinct, because once the artist dies, you can't really, in all good faith, reconstruct these works properly. And I say this because I'm just going to talk about a few examples that I've worked with, just to indicate the relationship between film and video and how that relates to the issues we're talking about with video, and how it relates to what John was talking about, which is the very long-term care and presentation of a history, not assuming that anything that people understand in 50 years' time will bear any relationship to what we understand. I already feel very old because I have to explain what a shutter is. To me, a shutter on a camera is normal, and many works from the 70s conceptually were based on the principle of the shutter coming down. And the shutter, like all equipment, actions mimic the body, and of course the shutter mimics the blink of an eye. But now when you point a digital camera and you hear that silly little click and then you have to wait 3 seconds before anything occurs, it has nothing to do with the chamber of the camera and the shutter that comes down to trap the light. That's already something that younger curators I know don't ever think about. So that's alarming, and that's happening now. So I always start from the assumption that nobody will understand anything that I've assumed, spending a lot of my time with artists who are now in their 70s, or sometimes, as in the case of, say, Jonas Mekas, in their 80s, as well as the younger artists. And actually it's the dialogue back and forth between very young artists and much older artists that's one of the exciting things about the late 2000s and now. So we can see a performance by Joan Jonas here, Mirror, at the Guggenheim, as I did recently, and then you can see young artists being completely head over heels about that piece, which is reperformed. And it's that coming together of generations that I felt was important in the late 90s, as I heard young artists wanting to see work from the 60s and 70s, but not knowing where it was. And the reason they couldn't find it was because it was in cardboard boxes under artists' beds. This being one example. This is a piece by Judd Yalcott. It's called Destruct Film from 1967. It is a room filled with film, celluloid film, scattered all over the floor up to sort of ankle height. There is a film projected onto the back wall, and then there are 2 slides which are revolving around the room with beam splitters, with a carousel slide projector just out of the picture, I think. Oh no, you can see one of them there, moving around. And of course, at this point, you can see very clearly that this is, like so many works of that period, about the collapsing of cinema, the collapsing of the cinema space and of film itself in 1967, at a moment when that was really, when cinema was in yet another of its many crises. And I'm very much looking forward to, well, I won't see it, but a moment in 60 years' time, unless cryogenics means that we'll all be alive by then, when a young curator will put this next to something, by Corey Archangel perhaps, or by somebody else, and by, say, one of the artists in Haunted, and really to look at the space of cinema and what that means. And the ethical question of how to reconstruct this piece, which existed only as a review at the time I came across it, are very interesting, because I said to Judd Yalcott, who's luckily alive and able to work with me on this, well, what was the piece exactly? How does it work? The film still existed, the slides still existed, so all we had to do was determine the space, which was obviously in the Film and Video Gallery in the Whitney, different from Judson Church, because it was bigger, but not so much bigger that it compromised the piece, and find film, lots and lots of film strips. And what the audience do is you come into the room and you roll around. You can do, it's a very performative piece. Instead of the film being something that's on the screen, it's everywhere. It's unspooled, it's on the floor. We found people making out there, spending a lot of time there, wrapping the film around their wrist, taking it away. You'd find little bits of film strip up on the 5th floor. It's a very performative work that we were able to reconstruct because of the precise instructions Judd Yalcott gave, and because film labs still existed and were able to and happy to provide us with old thrown out bits of film. So as John was saying, in terms of the importance of history, I think that the curators that we all are now in museums have a very important responsibility, because we are the last generation who will have direct contact with artists from this generation. Because when artists from this generation in their 70s and 80s go, or even in their 60s, because you never know, it's going to change our whole relationship to this period, and a lot of work will be lost. So I think we all have responsibility to get in very, very close dialogue with the artists now. Now, in terms of video and film, if film ceases to exist, and we've stockpiled a large number of spools of film to throw across the floor when we next do this and say we've got enough for 10 more showings, can the film be shown on video? Well, my answer would be yes. I mean, clearly from a technical point of view it can, but it will look different because video has a hard edge, film has a soft edge. It won't be film in the same way. It won't be, the film, by the way, consists of images of the beginning parts of film that you don't normally pay attention to. Very similar to the corner, the emphasis on the corner that so many artists were also beginning to make in the 60s, from Dan Flavin to Joseph Beuys et al. These looking at parts of the film and looking at parts of the physical gallery space that were normally not paid attention to. The slides you can always digitize too, but then it becomes a different thing. So where does the line blur between something that has integrity and something that's migrated? It's one thing if you're migrating one video format to another, and the big problem with that, of course, is that rather fascistic medium of HD, and which is too light, too bright, too sharp, and completely not of this world. But it's quite another when you think about what you do when you transfer something like this, the projected elements to video, or something digitized. How much is lost? It varies. Anthony McCall has the same problem with line describing cone, for example. This is a really big question for all of us. Another artist I've been working with a lot recently is Klaus Oldenburg. I did a show of his Happenings films from the early 60s last year. And what was interesting about talking to Klaus, who's now in his early 80s, was the way in which this exhibition, in which, as you can see, all 8 films were projected together in the room of the Film Video Gallery, enlivened, to his mind, what was otherwise normally seen in kind of film programs, the films that were available, and there were very few of them. So what I did was restore several films in Klaus's studio, which he hadn't let anyone have access to for decades. So some of them, for example, Photo Death, had not been seen since it was made. Photo Death, there you see Henry Geldzahler acting in there, and also you can see the other film with the car over on the right. The Autobodies, the films were in a very bad state, and we managed to restore them and then transfer them to video. We projected them all in one room, and Klaus loved the way in which the films could all be seen together or focused on individually. And he said, well, this actually gives the sense of what the happenings were much more clearly than watching a single film projected in, say, a film program, because in a happening there was no single frontal viewpoint. So by putting together 8 films of happenings from the same period in such a way that you can go back and forth between them and look behind you and around you and in front of you, or choose to focus on one film, that he loved, because he felt it provided the energy of the performances made at the time. Now again, I wouldn't have known that had I not been able to work with Klaus very closely, and also sort of develop an idea for how to present them with him. Another thing I did was go up to Patti Mucha, who was Klaus's wife at the time and who acted in the films. She was one of the main stars of most of those happening films, for a lecture she gave on the films, and to see these color photographs that she showed of the happenings. And that also puts the black and white films into an important perspective. So I cannot underline the importance of research enough and meeting the people involved, not just the artist, but the people around the artist. And then I found this little Super 8 film. I said to Klaus, what's this? He said, oh, it's a film I made inspired by Stan Brackage's Songs films called Hole. And I said, you mean the hole you dug behind the Metropolitan Museum in 1967? He said, yes. So I said, well, let's transfer it to video and have a look at it. And we did. And he had, it turned out, 10 pages of notes on the making of this film. He took it extremely seriously. Who would have thought that Klaus was so interested in film in relationship to performance? So what we've done is, this is now in the collection of the Whitney, as are all the Happenings films, which he gave us as a gift. And this film is to be shown slowed down to 5 frames per second. Now, of course, the likelihood of getting a variable speed projector and a Super 8 film loop that would work for any long-term display of this being so remote, we've transferred it to video. This doesn't make it video art, it makes it a film transferred to video, and this is the kind of fluidity I'm talking about, and the history that John was mentioning. We are making very clear to have the entire history of the way this will appear in the future documented. So it will be at the speed of a variable speed projector showing the Super 8 film at 5 frames per second, but for practical reasons it will be on video, and of course it will lose something from a textural point of view, and that troubles me. But there we are. Now, of course, Nam June Paik's Magnet TV, one of the iconic pieces of art that happens to be video, and made by applying a very powerful large magnet to the top of this very old television set. Nam June signed it on the lower right, as you can see, actually the lower left, depending on which way you're looking at this image. And this cannot be moved now. I mean, we rarely lent it. We lent it for John's retrospective here at the Guggenheim. We're lending it again for a large Pike retrospective in Düsseldorf, but we almost never lend it because it's so fragile and because it's really precious. But here's an interesting thing. We cannot allow people to move the magnet because this is a performative piece. This is a piece in which Pike wanted people to come and move the magnet around and change the image, which at a moment when television sort of even existed, which it hardly does now, or if it does, it's in an extremely different form. But at a moment when television was very monolithic and really needed challenging, television was the sort of technological equivalent of painting, this was a very radical act. And for people to actually be able to move this magnet and change the image on a television set, just as Dan Flavin's early icon works only really existed when they were switched on, this is a radical questioning of the physical materiality of the art object and an introduction of time and also performativeness and interaction. Now, there's a very beautiful 18th century clock in St. Petersburg in the Hermitage. And it was made by an English jeweler and goldsmith, James Cox, in the 18th century, a commission for Catherine the Great. And at the center of this golden tree sits a peacock, and every hour the peacock's feathers come out, and he turns his head. There's also a cockerel and an owl that keeps the time, and the seconds are marked by a dragonfly's tail that touches a mushroom. Now, this automated tableau, which you could see as some kind of prefiguration of moving image installation in a certain sense, and was very popular in the 18th century, the end of the 18th century, is now only shown to the public once a week on Wednesdays at noon. And people go there and they gather there to see the peacock, and they come and see the clock working. And I'm wondering whether in the future Magnet TV might end up the same way, so that every Wednesday at 12, an art handler will come along and just move this magnet and allow people to see it, and it will be somehow something that people will know about and will be advertised, and it'll be a thing like the peacock. In 100 years' time, it will have that same historical status. Now, I'm not going to dwell too long on this wonderful piece by Michael Heiser, but this is a piece that actually I found categorized as video art when I came to the Whitney. In fact, it's not. It's more like a very, very large-scale slide piece. But I think that in terms of a projected image, the issue of whether something moves or not is very interesting. Michael Heiser made an earthwork in 1969 in Neuperlach in Munich. He dug a large hole. This is it. He then stood in the middle of it. There is a picture of him in the middle of it. Apologies for the bad slide. And turned with a Bolex camera on his heel and photographed the interior. Then made a series of sort of large glass slides that he then projected using these very strange projectors that a friend of his, Maris Ambatz, specially designed. So the resulting piece, which takes up our fourth floor gallery, where I'm doing a show of this piece, which I've been working on with Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, our head of conservation, very closely. The piece, actually, the projection, is a complete, and actually it's the only earthwork where this is the case. It's a complete physical, spatial equivalent to the original artwork. Here is one of the projectors. It's a very strange projector, and here are the slides, which are very large. So it's very interesting that we've again gone to digital with this, because this is, as you can see, almost a 19th century looking slide. So what does digital mean? What does video mean? Does video mean moving? Here's another slide. It's a very interesting question. Finch College Project by Robert Morris is another piece that I can see actually being transferred possibly to video. It began as a drawing that I actually found here in the Guggenheim's archive when Robert Morris had his archive here. And I asked him about it, and he said, oh, it's an installation I made in 1969. I said, but what is it? So to cut a long story short, there is an original photograph of it installed in Finch College in 1969. And then here is the piece being remade. And we remade it by making a photograph of a cinema audience, cutting it into grids. Here's Filippo Gentili, our art handler at the time, installing it on the wall, and then deinstalling it, taking it off again, and a mirror on the other side being installed and taken off, everything being filmed. And once you take those grids of photographs and mirrors off, that's what the wall looks like. Then you project the film back onto the wall, and that's the film, and those dots are the actual wall. And the film is projected at very slowly at 1 RPM. You could transfer this to video. You could. It's an issue if you do, because then it's not about film. Morris's question, however, was how to erase the image from the wall. It was a kind of attack on painting. So in this case, I think there may be an issue to argue that film can be transferred onto video without too much loss of integrity. But it's an open question. What do we do about holography? Here is Simone Forti's Striding Crawling, which is also in the Whitney's collection. It has no electricity at all, just a candle. It's up at the Whitney at the moment on display. But holography, luckily the holography studio downtown is still in existence, and we're still in a position to restore holograms like we did here. But holography has a very interesting relationship to what we're discussing. Likewise, Dennis Oppenheim's Echo is on video, but it was originally on film. Dennis said to me that he didn't have any conceptual reason to put it on film. It's just because he couldn't afford video at the time. And that, to me, was a fairly good argument for feeling comfortable about transferring it to video. Paul Sharrett's shutter interface began with this diagram, a very pretty detailed diagram, restored the two-screen version. Carol Green later restored the four-screen version. But this cannot, in my opinion, be transferred to video. This is not something that has any integrity transferred to video, because it is so much about the film frame. And that, I think Sharrett's someone Paul had a long relationship with and really showed brilliantly at the Whitney several times. The two-screen version is in our collection. The four-screen version is also in existence. What happens when film no longer exists? Well, perhaps the piece will cease to exist. Dan Graham's Rock My Religion. It turns out that Dan made two edits of this video. And some of us have collections, have the work in this collection in one edit, and some have it in the other. Which edit is right? The answer is both, because of the way Dan thinks and works. So we're about to undertake actually a long series of discussions with Dan at EAI, working with the EAI on this, to actually go through and document with Dan and talk to him about what he was thinking about when he made those two edits and why he did that. And that will mean that in the future, people will be able to determine which version to show. And the fact that the artist has an ahistorical view of their work, which all artists have, every time you want to, and this is a prime example, I'm going to finish with this image, every time you want to try and work with an artist restoring the work, they always want to update it. And here's a very interesting example. We have in the collection, as does MoMA, Ballad of Sexual Dependency by Nan Goldin. At MoMA, it's in the photography department. We look after it in the film and video area of what we do at the Whitney. We have slightly different versions of the piece. At the Tate Modern in the large turbine hall, Nan showed it recently, projected extremely large and with a live band playing underneath, and not necessarily playing songs from the original soundtrack. What does that mean? It's not slide anymore. Nan said in original notes that the ideal audience should be very intimate. The audience should be 80 to 100. It should be very sort of small. Now you have an enormous projection with hundreds and hundreds of people able to see it and a live band. What does that mean for the piece? And is it okay because Nan says it's okay? And is it okay to do that when she's no longer alive? These are all issues which I think are extremely important for curators to be addressing. And I would argue, in conclusion, that it's very, very important to have a direct dialogue with the artist, because at this point, when film and video and slide and any other kind of projection, when everything is so fluid, it's very, very important to document everything with the artist, to have an ongoing relationship with the artist, to video the artist not once, as we do several times over a period of years, to see if they've changed their mind as technology is changing, and to also be very, very careful to document very basic spatial, conceptual, and cultural ideas of what space is, what projection is, what the artwork means, because that changes profoundly over time. And we want to make sure that the footprints we leave for other people to interpret are clear, and that the artworks that we've collected and shown and brought in and taken care of continue to have a vibrancy that will become even more powerful as the decades and the centuries progress. Thank you. What about questions? Does anyone have questions or thoughts?
Thank you, Chrissie. That was fascinating. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the last points you were making, specifically in relation to translation and co-production, the curator's role, with these arts that change in media but also installation format. Are there limits? And in terms of, with the Nan Goldin example, would you ever say, no, I'm sorry, you said earlier in your career that the work of art couldn't be that, and now you're saying it can be something else? And also in terms of documentation and future curators and interpretation, how do we sort of set limits and document and guide future decision makings? It's a very complex territory, and you've had a lot of experience now doing this, so I'm interested if you could elaborate a little bit more.
Yes, I know you and I have talked about this before, and I think it varies according to the artist. I think, and also, by the way, everything that I've just said, it doesn't only apply to video. I mean, it applies as much to a Richard Serra sculpture or a Sol LeWitt wall drawing. And actually, when I did Sol's, the first retrospective of his structures, he wanted to repaint a painting from 1964 that I was borrowing from him. So, there was nobody to negotiate with but him. And I said no, and I really stood up to him. I was a young curator, and I thought it was wrong to repaint a painting from 1964. And his argument was, well, it's mine, and I want to do it because it just looks a bit grubby. And I said, well, yes, but the paint surface is 1964. And anyway, we had a little back and forth about it, and I won, and he didn't repaint it, partly because he was in New York and I was in Oxford. And so, and I took the piece straight from, in a crate from outside New York to Oxford. But then when the SF MoMA Whitney Solowitz show happened in 1998, I think it was, 99, I looked at that piece and it had been repainted, and he'd painted it, he'd got his way. But then I was talking to Susanna Singer about it, and she said, well, but he had a point because he wanted everything to look like new, and actually the surface didn't matter to him. So that's the kind of question that exists, and there's similar situations with Richard Serra and many other situations with painting and mainly sculpture and installation. So I think we need to think about this holistically and talk very closely with our conservators, particularly since many artists make work in different mediums. So we have to see the thing holistically because we have to understand how they're thinking about it. But at the same time, I do think that that there is, and by the way, our head of conservation, Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, has formed a replication committee, and we meet once a month and we discuss these issues. So at the Whitney, now what happens is that if there's anything remotely at issue regarding the restoration of something, the representation of something, the replication of something, it comes to the committee and we debate it. So for example, we're lending Nam June Paik's Pyramid and Magnet TV to the Dusseldorf show. In fact, the Pyramid they withdrew because for various reasons, but it would have been best to make an exhibition copy, and went back and forth for some time about researching monitors working with the Pike estate. And is a very interesting issue that was able to be played out through the replication committee. So anything would be it video installation, migration of video, film to video, slide, or sculptural painting or solid work wall drawing, it all comes to the replication committee and is very thoroughly documented. And so it's not just about your individual relationship with an artist and the discussion you have with an artist as a curator. I wouldn't feel happy making that decision purely on my own. I always bring it to the replication committee, to my colleagues, and I say, well, this is what the artist and I have discussed and we think should be the case, and this is what I would recommend. What do you think? And sometimes they say, absolutely, that sounds very sound. And sometimes they ask interesting questions that neither the artist or I might have thought of because we're so in the middle of it. And they'll say, but what about this and what about that? And then some kind of conclusion is reached. And that replication committee has proven extremely important for that issue. But there's no single answer to it. It really varies case by case. But I do feel that artists have a very ahistorical relationship to their work, and they're always fiddling with it, trying to change it.
I was going to ask, besides the curator and the conservator on that committee, are there other staff members representing other departments making a decision?
There's registration. There's curators, Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, and then two members of our registration staff. Sorry? Oh, yes, Nick. Nick, our legal counsel. There's Carol. Yes, thank you. Nick Combs, our legal counsel. Pardon? And the cataloger. Thank you. Other questions?
So I'll just follow up then. When did your replication committee begin? Is that a recent, has it been recently established? And also, are you going back into the collection to kind of document the decision-making that has happened up to the point that the committee was formed?
Well, Carol, perhaps, can you tell me the exact date? I can't remember. Carol Mancusi-Ungaro is here, so perhaps Carol can.
I think the committee was started about 2.5 years ago. It came out of a conference at the Tate Modern on replication, and I think it was called Inherent Vice, the Work of Art, Sculpture. The technical committee was divided up with different categories, and I was given authenticity and integrity or something like that. It was a small topic. Anyway, out of that came our committee back at the Whitney, and we try to represent all the departments that have an impact on the work of art. As Chrissie said, curatorial, conservation, registration, legal, and cataloging, because when you remake a work of art, there are real questions about cataloging. We haven't gone back into the collection. When it started, we didn't know how often we were going to meet. It turned out that enough issues come up that we actually meet once a month, which is shocking to us if you think about it. Questions come up with exhibitions, loans, joint purchases. All kinds of issues come up, and I think the committee has become a kind of intellectually interesting place that we debate these issues.
I think, sorry.
One last time. I'm struck at what may be some kind of ontological gap between the, let's take Judd's piece, its original presentation in Judson Church, is that right, the first venue, and its recreation or reincarnation in the Whitney. Now, not only might it not be appropriate to recreate the precise dimensions of the Judson venue inside the Whitney, it seems as a transformation in space and time of an earlier piece that makes its reincarnation one entity quite different from its original, which could never be recovered. And I wonder how we comprehend that gap, and when we may be just as happy or happier looking at documentation of its original incarnation. So it seems to me there's a particular value placed on documentation, even though it's video or film documentation of that original incarnation, which may supersede, maybe more important than the possibility for an institution like your own to revive the piece, even with Judd's collaboration. I've spoken to Judd about that piece as well, so I have some particular interest in that example.
Yeah, no, you raise a very important question. I think again, it's a case-by-case basis. I think in this case one can't necessarily be too precious about the original size of the space, for example, because that's simply the space that he was given. If the space that he had been given, if Judson had had a slightly larger exhibition space, he would have made it in that space. And so, that's why the dialogue with the artist at the beginning is so important, because the first question I asked was, well, how important is that, that particular space? And the answer was, oh, well, that's just what I was given. It wasn't important. Or say in Dennis Oppenheim's case, he said, well, I just didn't have access to video equipment. I just couldn't afford it. That's why it's not on film for any conceptual or philosophical reason. And so that's where the initial questions around the first presentation of the work are so important. The issue around that work was not really whether, something was 20 feet by 20 feet or 35 feet by 25 feet, but the performative aspect of that piece. So my concern was, can the integrity of the piece be retained in terms of its performative quality, whereby people come in and are able to engage with the piece. Now, of course, any piece made, it's like a car. It immediately becomes, what's the word for insurance, when you're insuring your car? It starts losing something the moment you depreciation, thank you. It immediately depreciates, not in terms of artistic or financial value, but in terms of the original, so-called original context. But that's true with every work of art. If you look at anything in the Metropolitan Museum that was originally hung in a church, you've already made a much greater leap in terms of context for a Titian or a Giorgione than you have with a Judd Yalcott. So it's a very important question, but I think the answer to it really lies in the specifics of the case and the dialogue with the artist. There wasn't documentation, visual documentation of that piece. There was simply a review describing it, which is very subjective. And of course, the artist's memory is also subjective. But we're talking about the fact that everything is time-based. We're time-based, buildings are time-based, objects are time-based, including paintings. Everything is time-based. And therefore, that's where one's judgment and connoisseurship comes in, and that's where the dialogue that I find so valuable with Carol Mancuso-Ungari, my colleague, about conservation. We talk and think about things from different points of view that hopefully arrive at the same conclusion, because you can't, there's no such thing as replicating anything. When you show a painting from the Otto Dix show that just closed, had a completely different resonance in the 80s. I remember seeing an Otto Dix show in 1979 in London. It had a completely different reading. Gerhard Richter's Bader Meinhof series was searingly upsetting and very disturbing in London in the 80s when he first showed it. It's so political. In New York, where the political resonance is not the same 20 years on, it didn't have that same feeling. Everything changes. The question is how you can, in a sense, everything is a fragment of something that happened. The question is how you can retain its power somehow to move people and affect people, and so that people can engage with it in some way. When we engage with the Giorgione, we have no relationship to its religious value, for example, or political value.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was very interesting. I was actually curious to hear a little bit more about the difference in approach you have regarding the 1964 original surface of a solid structure that you were so eager to protect from the artists, and the video work that was or the film work that, hang on, sorry. The film work
yes.
that you were, happily migrating to video because the artist's statement, if I had had video at my availability back in the 60s, I would have done it in video. And I, as a conservator, think that there is a historical value to be protected as well. And if the artist, at the point in his career in the 60s, didn't have the money to produce in video, then that is something that is very inherent to the piece, and I would want to, protect that as well as an authentic characteristic of that piece. Would you just maybe briefly point out the difference in between dealing with sculptural works and time-based media?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. I think the answer in this case is that I don't know anymore, because now I'm wondering whether Sol was right. Because I was speaking as a young curator who had just become involved in conceptual art and in Sol's work, and was a lot less experienced and had been trained as an art historian. I was trained in 17th and 18th century painting. That's my background. I did my thesis on Rembrandt. So I was approaching Sol's painterly surface as an art historian, where the painting surface is sacrosanct. And the idea to me that he wanted to repaint it was just impossible. To me, I couldn't, I just, that surface was sacrosanct. Conserved, okay, cleaned up a bit because, it may have been a little grubby from 1964 and stored in his storage. But conceptually, he was probably right, because Sol actually, and I knew him very well, he didn't care. He really didn't care about he had a very ahistorical, all artists, as I mentioned before, I think do, but he had a particularly ahistorical relationship to his work that had a conceptual basis to it. And so that's the first reaction in terms of, the painting. In terms of the glibness with which I was happy to transfer Klaus's whole to glibness is perhaps the wrong word. The ease with which I came to that decision, and with Dennis, is more of a question. And actually, I would like to, if we ever had the money, or we lent it out to someone so that they could make the experiment, to see what it looks like on film and compare. And ideally, that's what I would love to do. And since we're still completing the work on Klaus Oldenburg's whole, perhaps we will do both. Perhaps we will actually make a 16mm print, slow down to 5 frames per second, and have that as a film loop and have video, so that you actually have preserved both, you have both options for the future, just in case.
I have just one 30-seconds comment. Sorry. I, of course, fully agree with you that you can't apply traditional conservation ethics to conceptual works necessarily. You know, if the surface has always been intended to be bright and clean, of course, that's what we do, you know. We can, I think so, discuss respraying and so forth. I would just like to question that the film, or that the film piece of the 1960s has ever been intended to become video, because I would argue that the artists back in those days did not foresee, you know, that future migration. And that's the difference,
that's right.
I think.
That's right. They didn't foresee that future migration, you're right. I do think it depends on, I would like to take a multiple approach in the works we have, which we sort of do. We have a lot of film installation on film, and we have a lot of films on film. I restored all Robert Morris's films. We're in the process of restoring the last one with the Tate, neoclassic, and we have them in the collection. He gave them to us as a gift on film. So all the film works we have as film. The Klaus Oldenburg is still in process, but the migration from Super 8 to video, which occurred with a lot of artists, particularly Naumann, but also Vito Conci, and you know, the videos that are available through EAI, the artists took a very pragmatic view of their work. They wanted it distributed, they wanted it seen, which is sort of the principle of Castelli, Sonnabend takes in films. They wanted the works out there and for people to see them. And so they made the decision then to put them on video. And I think the Dennis Oppenheim question is still a question. And it's the same with, you know, Naumann's Spinning Spheres at the Guggenheim Ohm. When I showed it in Into the Light, Naumann had shown it on video in Europe and decided he wanted to see it on film. So we transferred it to film and showed it on film loops. And so I think I think we're working through those things. And I really, really want to be a purist. And I find myself working a lot with film archivists and film archives for that reason, in terms of film. And then with video, preservationists with video. But then you've got the third thing, I know we've got to, which is computers, and the fact that with contemporary works, I'm often buying hard drives, which is a whole other issue that I'm sure we'll get into later on. Thank you.